I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Scott Jackson. I'm the, the architect and developer for Gold and Moab Accounting Manager. Today we're going to talk about, well, I want this to be of as much value as I can. I know a lot of you have come to conferences year after year. So I'm not going to give a general overview of MAM. I expect many of you have a lot of background with that. For those of you who need some, more of a tutorial, I can spend some time with you or schedule some time with you later on through the proceedings, and I'll catch you up on Moab Accounting Manager. I'm going to spend a little bit of time to take this opportunity to go a little more in depth, give you the new features that have been integrated into the product since the last Moab-Con. And I'm also going to go over some best practices of some new methodologies and also talk about, well, I'll just go to the agenda page right here, and we'll see that. This is what we're going to go over today. So first I'm going to introduce some terminology changes. This was to synchronize the nomenclature between the rest of the Moab suite. And I'm going to do that first, so I'll use that I'll use the common nomenclature throughout the rest of the presentation. It'll be familiar to you. And then I'll proceed into the new features of Moab Accounting Manager since the last Moab-Con. We'll talk about some best practices of a new methodology for implementing automatic allocation cycle. We'll talk about some best practices and some work that we're doing in scalability and performance improvements. I know that'll be interesting to some of you. And then we'll finish on features and things that we'll be doing in the future. As kind of a matter of course here, we'll probably ask you to save general questions until the end, but if you need clarification on the current subject in hand, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll be happy to answer that. I don't want to keep anybody from lunch, and that's why I'm asking to do that. So first of all, Moab Accounting Manager, just make sure everybody knows what we're here for. That's the accounting component. It can be used for tracking the resource utilization, but it's more powerfully used to bill back and to capture usage records, how much maybe those are, to charge those out maybe to the users in other words, calculate a cost for those, and even more so to enforce certain allocation limits. So now in 7.2, Moab Accounting Manager 7.2, some of the principal objects were changed. If you've noticed, you may have probably noticed in the product that Gold and Moab were created separately, primary, and then they were kind of married later on, but we still had some differences in the names. For example, in Moab Accounting Manager, you had the word account, but in Gold and MAM it was project, and that was always been a stumbling block for us to discuss what we're talking about. And then MAM had the idea of the account, which is the pool of funds or credits, and that was different from what Moab had. And then they both had the concepts of reservations, but they were different. There was the accounting reservation versus the job reservation, so we synchronized this in Moab. They're both called account now in both Moab Accounting Manager and Moab Workload Manager. The pool of funds, the pool of credits is now called a fund. You create a fund and you can associate it back to an account. And now we have the concept, it's called a lien in Moab Accounting Manager. So I'm going to be using this. I just wanted to introduce this nomenclature. It allows us to have web services having a common view of what things mean. It allows you to do an account query and then pull the pieces from Moab Accounting Manager and Moab and integrate them together in a common result for you and things like that. Of course, that's integrated into the GUI and into the new command line clients and things like that, the new terminology. So here's we'll just go through some of the changes that you might be aware of. A lot of these changes came because of requests. So I'll introduce them to you. The first thing is a new methodology for managing allocations. And I'll go into more detail about this later. It's called Allocation Reset. I'll show you how to use it later, but right now what it means is that when you can clear out an allocation just by chewing a G-change fund reset 1, it basically is similar to making a withdrawal of the current amount back to 0. And the reason and then we actually have a variation on that. The deposit now, when you make a deposit, it doesn't just add to what you had before. It can make a resetting deposit, which it's an atomic operation that reduces it to 0 before it gives it a new value. Because it's typical that people will want to just reset the allocations to certain designated amounts on their allocation cycles. So here's an example of the GUI. You have a reset button that you can push there. Now, some sites wanted to be able to itemize their charges. Composite charges were things like a job might charge for memory and processors and GPUs and different things like that. And then they get this charge of like 23. Well, what parts were for what component? And so it is possible if you actually set in the Goldie.com charge itemization equals true. That will enable this new table called the charge table to come out, and then it'll break it down. So here we have job 1 and had use from processors and memory, and these are their rates that were charged out, and here's the amount. So maybe 12 was due $4 for processors and $8 for memory, and here's the details of how that was calculated. Let's see. Another thing that people have asked for sometimes when you just set things up, maybe at first you don't really want to establish allocation limits. You just want to make it open up, and then you just want to establish a bill, a charge for usage, but you don't really want to block them at any point. So the answer to that in the past has been just create an allocation that's really large, 100 trillion or something like that. But that's just messy to see. So they'd asked if we could create an infinite allocation or an infinite credit limit, and we responded to that. When your database supports a data structure that'll support infinity, then we can do that. So Postgres is an example of a database that does support this standard. So you can make a deposit, you say infinity, and then in that point, subsequent charges will not decrease the balance. And also you can make a credit limit infinite, and then they can continue to go negative to an infinite amount. Go ahead.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
Do you have that reset from quarter to quarter as well, like the start and end time on that infinity allocation?
You could, but it wouldn't make any sense because it's still infinity.
Well, this is for the tracking, so that you can see how much was used in a given quarter.
Well, you're still going to track, in the usage table, it's still going to track like how much was charged. The charge amount won't be infinite, it'll be finite. But the allocation balance will stay infinite all the way along. So there's actually no point in resetting the charge, because not only will the charge be infinite, but the deposited amount will be infinite. And to reset that to infinity is going to make absolutely no change to that allocation. Yeah.
Does MySQL support that?
It does not. Yeah. So MySQL is one that does not. I could not find a way to implement that in MySQL. So alternative constraints, it's more of a technical debt issue. We wanted the ability to specify, to share like funds, okay? So I want a fund that's shared between 3 different accounts, chemistry, biology, and physics. Previously, it was always an and, it was an and operation. So you could have a fund that said, for account chemistry and machine red, this was what you could use, but you couldn't say or. So now, if you have constraints of the same name, like account, so here's an example. Accounts of the same name are ORed, and accounts of different names are ANDed. So an account, if you say account equals chemistry, account equals biology, user equals Amy, user equals Bob on a fund, those are the constraints. It would be used by the user, Amy, or Bob, and the account biology or chemistry. So it just gives you more ability to do sharing of your resources, of your funds. Now we always had the ability to do charge rate ranges, which meant you could charge a certain rate for between two processors and 4 processors would be a certain rate, and between 5 processors and 8 processors would be a different rate. But it didn't really handle values in between very well. And it didn't say up to, but not including the 4 is one rate and things like that. So we have a new syntax for handling floating point charges. So power, if it's less than 2, it would be 0.05. If it's greater than or equal to 2, but less than 4, then it'd be that, etc. Conditional charge rates, also a feature that was been requested. How can I say, I just want to give a certain rate to project? If it's this project and this user, then I want to give them a certain rate. Well, then, now that's possible through what's called conditional charge rates. I'll just jump right to an example. Example here is, let's say I want the staff group to have a different charge rate for processors. So you'd say group equals staff with a question mark there, and the rate would be different there. Then 50% discount would be available for processors on staff. So another example down here in this presentation, which should be available on our website, you could say user equals Scott Moe and project equals chemistry. So you could do ands and ors also with this syntax, and they would get a special rate or charge. Another thing we did in 7.1 was we added an event scheduler. Previously, Moab Accounting Manager was very passive. It received inputs. It really didn't do any actions on its own. But now there's an event scheduler where you can schedule activities. You schedule certain commands to run within Moab on specific time frames or a repeated basis. So you might want to do this if you want to make regular deposits, for example, or you want to disable something at a certain time. You're not going to be there during that time. This is kind of an alternative to those allocations with start and end times, and we'll see that just in a little bit later. But this shows an example from the GUI within Viewpoint or the standalone CGI GUI of listing events. Events have a fire command. This is the gold SH command that they would run, the low-level command that they would run. And this is when it would fire. And this is how often it would repeat. So yep. And then, do you want it to rearm on failure? How do you want it to notify you of the message? Whether you want it, if gold was down, MAM was down during the time it should have fired, do you want it to catch up on all the events that it missed? Things like that. So through the GUI, you can list and delete events, but you've got to create them right now through the gold SH command. I'll show you an example of that. And then the notifications for those things that run when you're not there, you need to be able to store their responses, whether they're successful or failure, what the message was, so you can see what happened in the past. Now I know there's many sites that have arrangements where, well, you can either have one Moab Accounting Manager handling multiple counts, multiple clusters, but you can also break up and have each cluster have a different Moab Accounting Manager. And sometimes that's needed, especially if you're geographically separate locations and you don't want to have the delays, latencies for the commands. So how do you administer that from a central location? Well, we did do some work to allow that as a possibility. Now all of your connection information is in a new site.conf file, and the site.conf file contains like the host name, the secret key for connection and port, and you can not only just put your local one, but you can also put this connection information in for all of your different golds, and that way from a single location an administrator can make deposits. Here's an example: deposit to the site Kansas. Oh, killed that. Deposit to the site Kansas, or run a balance at site Watson. What's the balance of the chemistry project at the site Watson? You can do that without actually logging in and SSHing to that remote location, provided all the ports are available. Later on, we want to extend that further to be able to incorporate balances across, Right now, you'd have to run multiple gbalance commands if you had multiple locations. Later on, I think our plan is to integrate this so you could run gbalance, and it could integrate the values across the different sites for you, but that's not done yet. Okay, and one last thing, I clicked to it wrong, but the client authentication uses setuid Perl to establish the identity of the caller and make sure that they perform their roles. They act within their roles. But setuid Perl is being deprecated, and it's not available in Perl versions 5.12 or later. So we have a replacement strategy. It's called GUI security promotion method. You just should be aware that that's available. It should automatically kind of pick the right one when you install it. If setuid Perl is there, it'll use that. Otherwise, it'll use GUI, which requires, CC. When you do the make, it's going to compile a little setuid program similar to mauth, or it's a little bit like Munge. And then new features in 7.2, we talked about the name consistency improvements. That allows us, like I said, to have a common space in Moab Web Services and Viewpoint. Another request is to, when you add a user to an account, many people want that to become that user's default account. So that then if they only belong to one account, they shouldn't need to specify an account when they charge. And that just saves you a step of having to add the user to an account and then also have to set that as their default account. So the first account that they're added to becomes their default account if you set this parameter in goldie.com. Another thing that becomes important, many sites as they go along, over the years, they accumulate lots of data in the database. The transaction table becomes very large. The journals become very large in the allocation table. And things like statement take longer and longer to run. That's kind of inevitable with the database. So we've had the request sometimes, can you prune it back? How do we get some of these entries out in a safe manner? Well, the answer is difficult because they are interrelated in very sophisticated ways, and so it's always been difficult for us to say. But we finally did put in a command that will do this in a very safe and consistent manner. It's called system prune. So you would run gold.sh system prune and give it a retention time. This tells you, this says basically trim off everything before the beginning of 2011. There's also a syntax that allows you to say retention period, so you can say hold back at least a whole solid quarter. This is what this would mean. And that way you can use it this way inside of the event system and say every time trim off the old quarter. Every time we reach the end of a quarter, trim off the one before this one. So we always have at least a full quarter available. Another request has been, I got to install MAM. I install it on the head node, but hey, I want to install the clients. I want to install the GUI on a separate node. How do I do that? And we now have options that allow you to install the clients and the GUIs as separate. So to install the MAM clients on the system, you would configure, you just specify the same secret key that was used to the server. Oh, sorry. Let's see if I can get back to that. And you'd make clients only, and then make install clients only. And the same for the GUI. You would just install the GUI, only the graphical user interface parts on your Apache server. And here's another very useful feature, job submission validation. And the idea is, when you submit a job, you might want to check the funds at that time to make sure they have sufficient funds. Typically, our answer for that has always been, you need to create a submit filter and do it at that stage. We don't have a built-in way to do it, but now we do. You set this in Moab.cfg. You can set validate job submission and set it to true, and then you would further say what you want it to do if they're out of funds or if Moab's not available, or if the projects, they don't belong to the project. This is actually common separated value. The first one, I think, is what to do for insufficient funds, and then the next one would be what to do for all the other cases. So this is going to, if that's true, then it will check that at the job submission. That way, 3 days later when the job runs, they don't just get rejected because they didn't have funds in the beginning. Yeah?
Does it depend upon MSUB or will the other versions of TORC with the Q-sub?
This will work whether you Q-sub or M-sub.
So the Q-sub would get the direct feedback.
Let's see. That's a good question. I'm trying to think of what it would do. It might not get it from Q-sub. It might have to see that the check job shows the job is canceled and it has a message on it. So M-sub, you would get the direct feedback. But Q-sub, you probably wouldn't because this is a Moab parameter. That's correct.
Sorry, Scott, are you aware of any notification messages in Moab to advise for when a job is rejected? So I know it has some log entries, but Moab will send a notification to the user if the job is preempted and things like that. So is there something equivalent?
Right now, it just marks it in the job. You'd have to see it in check job. You'd notice that it was on hold or that it was canceled, and you'd do a check job -B, and you'd see a message in it. It would say, bank failure and the following reason. It would give a detailed reason if you're at least 7.2, if you're at 7.2, 7.1 or higher. But it currently doesn't send you an email or anything like that. We could do that, but you'd have to use the native interface, which runs the script, and we'll talk about how there are some ways where you can do that, but I know there's performance issues with that. So hopefully that understanding will be there after I talk about a few more things. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to best practices. Those are the new features since our last Moab-Con. There's many more, but those are the ones I thought I'd highlight. So now this is just going to kind of highlight how to use this new resetting allocation scheme, because the former scheme was, we always, if someone had an allocation period, let's say in this example we're doing quarterly, but in reality, we have customers doing this monthly. Consider all the work that they have to go through to create an allocation for each month with a beginning time and an end time, and as the year marches on, the time comes in, this one becomes active, and users start using it down, and then the end, whatever's left over, kind of goes away, and then they get a new disbursement the next month. But they've got to set for each project. You got to set up 12 different separate allocations and manage those individual times, and it's a lot of management. And so to address that, that's why we developed this resetting allocation methodology, where you could just have the one allocation. You just set it up once for the account, and you never need to mess with creating new allocations. What you do is just do resetting deposits on a schedule. So you come along, you make your initial deposit here, and if there's anything left over here, it just gets reset, effectively like let's withdraw the rest and start over with the new amount. And that's just the resetting allocation paradigm. I'm going to show you some examples of how to implement that at your site, and we found that I feel that's a much better and easier approach overall. It doesn't quite have the boundary conditions. We do well at the boundaries here, but it's even cleaner when you have it, and simpler. So, but the thing with resetting allocations, of course, you've got to make the deposit at the right times. So how do you do that? You can either automate it through a cron script, which I'll provide an example here through this presentation, or you can use a new event engine. If you're using the cron script, then you just need a source where you keep the updated list of allocations. It could be a flat file, as in our example, or it could be a database or LDAP or something else like that, where you update the amount that it's going to be for the next cycle. And then this is an example of a cron job. All it's doing is reading this file. It's in Perl. It's reading this file into an associative array, and it checks the funds. And if the fund exists, then it resets it with the new amount. Otherwise, it resets it to 0. Alternatively, you can use the new event engine. You enable the event scheduler to fire up here by editing the gold.conf and uncommenting event scheduler equals true. Then you set the poll interval to how often you want it to check for new events. This is in minutes, so that's a 5-minute interval right there. Then this example shows you your event, creating an event that the fire command that it runs is fund deposit. So it's depositing funds into account biology. Here's the amount, and it's telling it it's a resetting deposit. It tells us you want to fire this in beginning of March. So the beginning of the second quarter of March of 2013, and then we want to rearm this, or we want it to repeat at the beginning of each quarter indefinitely. There's no end time here specified. You could specify an end time as well. So now we're just set to create reset the allocation to 100,000 every quarter, and it just goes on without our touching it until we want to change that. Yeah.
So can you have varying, let's say you do it by quarter and there's different numbers of days from one quarter to the other, or by month, there's all this different days. Does this account for that?
I'm trying to think of how there are scripts that I've accounted for that, but the scripts that I've used, it actually takes an average approach and just says, take the total number of seconds that would be in the average month and gives you that, and as opposed to saying 30 in this month and 31 in that month. So no, this script does not account for that. This script just gives you a raw amount and doesn't try to calculate hours differently. But you just have to make a more sophisticated script.
Or I suppose in the event scheduler.
Well, you wouldn't do this in the event scheduler. If you actually wanted to do 30 days on one month and 31 days on another month, you'd have to use the cron job methodology. Is that okay? Okay. See how we're doing. Oh, we're really hitting the end. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. I think this will be very interesting to you, though. So I know many of you, or some of you, are experiencing some pain on the performance between Moab and Moab Accounting Manager. It is one of the more expensive operations within Moab. I'm just going to mention that you probably, most of you know that you need to tune your database by vacuuming regularly. If you don't know that, that's going to be very important to recovering performance. In MySQL, you want to use, you want to split your NODB tables, your transaction tables up one per table. That's going to help with performance. You're going to want to delete old data that if you don't need around, that can improve performance. Just be aware that fallback makes an extra call per job. So instead of 2 calls per job, there's 3 because you have to have one at the submission time. What I really want to convey is 2 things. One is that we're doing active development on improving this problem. The problem really is we can't get rid of the time entirely. But what we can do is, the problem is that Moab is calling all these things in a blocking manner. It's going through the scheduling thread. For every completed job, it's waiting from a response from Moab Accounting Manager for every charge. Every time you start a job, as you start a bunch of jobs, it's waiting to see if the lien is successful to see if it can start the job. So what we're doing in the next version, next release, is we're having a separate accounting thread pool that handles the accounting calls. So Moab will instead just push it onto the request queue. It'll handle that kind of offline, and Moab will go on into its scheduling cycle and continue, and it won't be interrupted by the accounting. So this will be a big improvement. People are experiencing problems with job arrays. They submit a really large job array, and if they either cancel it or if it starts, it can slow Moab down to the point where you might have 5-10 minutes before a check job can come back, and this is presenting a serious problem. So this thread pool will help it. But there are some things we can do now. I know I'm hitting close to 12, so I won't be offended if someone needs to leave. I think I have about 5 more minutes of things I could explain, and I think it'll be useful for some people, so I'll try to hurry through it. Yes?
You have till 12:15.
Oh, I do?
Lunch starts at 12.
Oh,
You have 15
Phew.
minutes.
I thought I was, okay, good. I'm not doing nearly as bad as I thought. Okay. I'm going to show you a methodology that can improve your currently, without waiting for the patches, without waiting for the fixes that are going to come out in probably the next HPC release or two. There's some things you can do now if you can deal with a less strict enforcement model. I've talked to many sites that it's not necessary either. First of all, there's some that don't even need to do enforcement at all. They're just charging. They're just tracking allocations. They really don't need to have the expense of the lien. There's other sites that want to do the enforcement. They still want to shut you down, but if you run out of funds, but it doesn't have to be at the exact moment that you run out of funds. It doesn't have to prevent you from going negative. It's just that if you go negative, we want to then stop further jobs. If you can survive with that, just a slightly relaxed strictness of enforcement, then we can do some really stronger thing. I mean, much more performant operations. So let's actually take the first one first, the first one is going to be where you actually don't need to enforce it all. Then here, now I told you in the last Moab-Con, I suggested you steer away from the native interface because the native interface is calling a script, and those scripts are then doing an extra fork and exec, and if you really need performance, they're also loading the libraries for logging and for XML parsing, and it doubles the amount of time it takes to execute the liens and the charges. So I suggested that if performance is important to you, that you stick with a direct interface. But that's not necessarily true in these modes because we can avoid the overhead by doing these tricks here. So if all you need is just to charge, but you don't need to get the liens, you don't need to enforce limits, then you don't need anything other than this end URL. So what you do is you say type equals native for your accounting manager type. That's set by setting configure with AM equals native when you configure it. If you've already configured it, like I say, just change the type to be native. At that point, you need to find the scripts that are called. And the only script that we need in this mode is the end URL, which means the script that is called at the end of the job. And now this one, instead of calling the Perl script as it would normally do, we're simply calling a shell script which backgrounds the Perl script. Okay, real easy. We're just putting it in the background. So this is just a wrapper around the normal charge script. And so then you don't incur the cost. It just returns immediately, and it goes ahead and handles that in the background. That will really, that'll make a big difference, a huge difference. And even this will make a huge difference. I'll categorize that in a minute. If you do need allocation enforcement, but you can tolerate a less strict model where an account could go negative and then you turn it off, then what we can do is instead of getting a lien at the beginning, we can simply check to see if the account's active or not. So what we do is we implement an identity manager that runs every hour, looks at all the account balances, and it sets a flat file or a database to say whether this account is active or inactive. And then all the start request has to do is check to see at start time whether that's true or false. It doesn't need to go to MAM. So we define the start URL. Again, it's type native, it's start URL, and we say run this script, and the script is, and I'll show you this script. Do the same thing with a wrapper on the end to make that really fast. And then we do some things in Moab to help, because we're not doing the lien, so we're not checking certain other things like does the user belong to the project and things like that. So we need to enforce this through Moab. So the way we do that is through the same identity manager. It's going to do two things. It's not only going to update that flat file, but it's also going to import a bunch of information into Moab and tell Moab to enforce it. So this is going to import the users that belong to the accounts, what default accounts the users have. It's going to import all that into Moab. You'll see that through the various mdiag commands that way. And this flag right here, enforce account access equals true, will make Moab enforce the fact that this user can only submit to the following projects. This will run every hour, and it will update that script. So here's an example of what that identity manager would look like. Here you run the GLS user command, and then you use that to populate Moab right here with the user, what accounts they belong to, and what their default account is, or other way around. Then it runs checks the balances and updates this flat file accordingly. Then that start script, it simply parses the account out of the XML, looks it up in that flat file, and it either succeeds if it has a sufficient balance, or it gives an appropriate message that will show up in the check job -v if there's not a sufficient balance. The effect of that could be you place the job on hold or cancel, whatever you want your action to be based on that same parameter I showed you before. The start failure action will determine what you want the job to do as a response of being out of funds or something. But this is much faster than going to MAM and back. So I just want to give you, so I have implemented this at a site. We went out to a site and implemented this as a proof of concept because they just had, they'd have 50,000 jobs running at a time. They could have 100,000 jobs running in a day. And we saw a 100-fold increase in the latency. Basically, how long does it take to submit a job or to submit and start a job? So I just wanted to offer this as something. I know some people will be interested in this. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So finally, I wanted to go over what's coming up next. I think I've already kind of let that out, which is our main work is this improved scalability and performance. So this will make a big difference to those people who are doing job arrays, to those people who are on kind of the edge, suffering from long Moab iterations because of all the communication and accounting, that separate thread pool. And we're making some other just small changes like improving the charge model, the charge rate model. We won't have all the weird NBMs and VBRs and the types. It's a much more it's a much more easier to use model that also prevents you having to use small fractions for daily charges and things like that. And we're going to continue to look into these methods that will improve scalability, maybe with trade-offs with synchronization. One thing I would request from you is if there's something that you want to be in the MAM product, find a way to leave that information with me. If there's, I don't know if you guys have things you're filling out, but just get with me or send me an email. I'm Scott at adaptivecomputing.com, and so we can filter in the priorities of the different needs you have in the accounting system. I'm having more and more influence over the different layers, over Moab, over web services as time goes on, and so I think we're making this solid throughout the product and getting it better integrated. And so that's pretty much what I have. Are there any general questions or anything I can answer for the group? Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about what your aspirations are in terms of putting this into the Moab web services and stuff like that?
Okay, that's a good question. Thanks, Chris. We've got some things going through that have been implemented in web services, but they are mostly driven by specific use cases, and I think this is a good takeaway that we need to finish that. There have been people who want to have more of the web services implemented for the query. Okay, so my plan is to My desire is to see all the query APIs done first, so that you can ask what's the status of everything, what's the balances, what's the status of the users, and things like that. So I do want to carry that to product management, so that they know this request has come from several different customers. Certainly we need to use it. Our plan is to integrate it into there so it can be used by Viewpoint, because we want to get more and more pages into Viewpoint. I've been told to expect, or our goal is to get the user pages in the next release or a very soon release of Moab. Those are user-oriented pages into Viewpoint, such as balance checks, what's the statement, things like that. And then in later releases, we'll release the admin pages. But that is a priority of mine, and I'll bring that to product management to make sure that they know to do that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
For the job submission validation,
Yeah.
would we be able to configure that so where if a user submits a job and they don't have funds and it's going to go to windfall, that the job gets submitted, but it puts out a comment saying that the funds aren't there and it's going to windfall, or is it only a do or die?
You know, I'm going to have to think about that, Tara. Tara. I haven't thought about how the windfall is going to, how the fallback QoS operation is going to be affected by the submit filter, because in both of those modes we're doing submit validation, we're doing a quote at job submission, and in the job filter, in the fallback QoS or fallback account, we're also doing a check at the beginning with the quote. Which one happens first and how they influence each other is something I'll have to think about and answer your question. So I'll try to answer you afterwards, okay? Okay. Well, thank you very much.